Hello and thank you for joining us for our fourth installment in our Lessons Learned from Industry Leaders series. My name is Jason Mills. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at KMC Controls, and I want to take this time to welcome and thank each one of you for joining us. On our panel today is Pete Tewes, Luis Alvarez, and Steve Fay. Pete's a senior sales engineer with KMC Controls and has nearly 25 years of experience. Pete has been surrounded by electronics and building controls since the age of 2, starting when his dad would stick him in air handlers to help calibrate temperature sensors. Pete has dozens of certificates and qualifications and enjoys getting outdoors with his fiancée Amy and their 2 dogs, Ginger and Rufus. Luis is the founder and CEO of Alvarez Technology Group, ATG. Since founding ATG in 2001, Luis Alvarez has led the company to grow from a small 2-person consulting company to a premier technology solutions provider in California, delivering security, Internet of Things, and information technology services to more than 200 companies throughout the state. Steve is the CEO of Totem Buildings, the industry's leading risk management platform for operational technology systems. Steve's industry experience includes more than 35 years in the building automation industry, having served most recently as president of Tritium. Steve is an avid golfer and lives in Richmond, Virginia. Today's panel will be discussing the importance of security in a post-COVID world. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat box. And we'll do our very best to answer those questions at the end of the webinar. Any questions that we can't get to, we'll do our very best to email you those answers as soon as possible. I don't want to take any more time than I need to, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Steve. Steve.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this seminar and having the opportunity to tell you more about security in this post-COVID world. I think what's really of significance right now is, because so many of us are working remotely, is that security becomes even a bigger factor in how we think about the control systems that go into buildings. So first subject is defining what we mean by OT cybersecurity. I think that the key thing to appreciate is that control systems, whether they be for running HVAC, elevators, lights, meters, and so on, in our smart buildings today, are subject to the exact same threats from a cybersecurity standpoint as IT systems. So things like ransomware are absolutely getting into OT servers. Credentials are being stolen, data is being stolen. The individuals involved, whether facilities personnel or contractors, are being phished actively. These systems are susceptible for sure to DDoS, or denial of service attacks. So all the same things. What's fundamentally different, our systems are connected to real-time environmental processes that run 24/7. We're not an isolated world, and as such, there are unique consequences to when cybersecurity threats become realized. So that's, I think, the first thing to appreciate, the differences between IT cybersecurity and OT cybersecurity. Second topic here is to talk about physical accessibility. You know, when we think of cyber, we're thinking virtual, we're thinking virtual, and we're thinking logical security, not physical security. But the systems that we have show up physically in a number of ways, starting with the fact that a server and a workstation typically are located in a control room somewhere. Well, the picture I pulled here of, if you can make it out, is of a sticky note with a password on it. This was for an actual control system that someone took a photograph of that got breached. And this is not uncommon, that the credentials for the system become easily discoverable by somebody walking into a room. Another example is simply failing to log off your session automatically if you walk away from the room, like we would do in an IT world. So whether it's unrestricted access to the control room itself, or even being able to stick a thumb drive into a USB port, these are all ways in which physically you can attack a system, and people do. Ideally, System servers should be just that, the server itself without the keyboard and the monitor. It should be installed in a computer rack, just like any other IT device. And the only software on it should be the operating system, the database, and the application itself. You should not be using OT servers for anything other than their intended application, because that's one of the key ways these systems become vulnerable. So yes, physicality absolutely matters. So one of the questions of this seminar we're trying to answer is, what are the top risk areas? What can go wrong? Why should I really care about this? Well, if you think about life safety, if the lights go off when it's dark outside, if somebody gets into your access or video surveillance system, that's clearly a life safety event that just occurred. When systems go down, get compromised by things like ransomware, it can take sometimes weeks to recover. If the ransomware hits the server and there's not a good backup, I can point to examples where it's literally taken weeks to get that system reprogrammed and get the building fully back and operational again. Equipment can be easily damaged by someone getting in there and messing around with a chiller or an air handler, and that can be very expensive to repair that damage. And of course, it's common for OT systems in some way or fashion to be connected to the building's IT network, which means the corporate data now becomes accessible through the OT system. And all of this leads to brand damage. And increasingly, we're seeing regulatory compliance come into the space, and we're not really ready to be in compliance. So whether if you're in the healthcare industry or the military, regulations are already coming in. And the last point here is insurance. Insurance industry has not even begun to wake up to the fact that cyber can hit these systems as easily as it can hit IT systems, and their policies aren't clear about whether they're going to cover you if and when the breach occurs. So there's a lot of maturity that's needed in this industry in that regard. So one of the key questions that gets asked is, okay, what do I need to do? You've convinced me that's a problem. I need to pay attention. What can I do to mitigate my risks? Well, the first thing I mentioned here is treat your OT server like it was an IT server to the same standards. So that means you're patching it regularly. You're ensuring that that the accessibility to it from a user perspective is tightly controlled, that it doesn't have any software on it other than the application itself, that you're monitoring the hardware to make sure it's healthy. These are all the kinds of things that are routinely done for IT servers. It should be no different for an OT server. User access is very poorly done as an industry. So everything from who determines whether I can add a user to the system or not, to when somebody leaves the organization, how long does it take for that individual to be removed from the system? And this is very important from the contractor perspective, because often the contractor credentials are live in the system for years after employees have left, and it's a major security violation. The network, both locally and from a wide area perspective, those communications need to be secured, and often they are not. They're inadequately secured. Backups. The number one most important thing you can do to help you recover quickly from a breach is to make sure you have a backup that's current and it's not sitting in the same server as the application. Because when that server gets hit with ransomware, you just lost your backup. So it needs to be like IT. That server needs to be located that backup needs to be located in a secure location. And lastly, keep your software up to date. That's very important as well. It's an obvious one, but manufacturers do come out regularly with patches, and they should be installed when released. Now, we live in a different world in OT versus IT. The life cycle for the IT world is generally 3 to 5 years before hardware gets replaced and upgraded. And it's pretty sure everybody on this call appreciates the fact that control systems, the perspective is 10, in some cases as high as 20 years. So often when you go over 10 years, the system itself is no longer being supported properly by the underlying manufacturers, particularly operating systems. There are many systems out there still running Windows XP. So what do? Well, if you haven't already done it, you should air gap the system so it's not connected, say, to your corporate network. Tightly restrict who can gain access to it. Even consider eliminating remote access altogether over the internet so that you have to go on site. But like I said before, make sure that you've got a full image backup that includes the operating system, and you have available supportable hardware such that if either the hardware fails or the software gets compromised, you're able to recover in a reasonable period of time. So we want to, and particularly now as a result of what we've experienced with the COVID-19 pandemic, remotely accessing these systems is essential. It's a much safer way to do things from a human to human contact perspective. How should we do that securely? Well, there are a couple approaches that we often recommend. One is to use VPN software directly into the OT server. There's a wide variety of companies offering this type of software. I've named 3 here, but there are many others. And what that does is it encrypts all the user communications from the outside to the server and restricts who has access. So that's a fundamentally great first step. But in addition, you might want to very much look at solutions that look at the control network as well and really tighten down who can access every one of these devices and how the devices talk amongst each other as well as to the outside world. And you can do a lot of that with conventional technology from a Cisco, but increasingly now there are companies out there who have developed products and solutions specific for the controls industry. I'm mentioning 2 here that we're familiar with, nice enough, I guess, to do an ad for them, but TaziBox out of Finland and Tempered Networks out of Seattle, Washington are 2 that we're familiar with. So in the few minutes that I have remaining, I want to cover a couple additional topics here. One has to do, I mentioned this briefly, around user management. We just, as an industry, don't subject ourselves to the same types of controls regarding system administration that is common from an IT perspective. When you join a company, your system administrator tells you exactly what kind of passwords you need to use. They'll often ask you to change your passwords every 90 days. There's lots of controls in place around administering the users on the system. In the OT world, it's the Wild Wild West, generally speaking. Policies are ill-defined, and whether it's coming from the owner or from an engineering firm, the specifications that specify the system to begin with rarely refer to how the users are to be managed. And the last point here is about traceability. When you have a breach in cyber, particularly in the IT world, the first thing they try to go into are the logs to see if they can figure out who got into the system and what they did. Well, a lot of systems today have the ability to do something similar, where if the user activity has been turned on and those logs have been saved, that's your way to try to figure out what happened. So this is an area that definitely needs a lot of attention and often gets overlooked. So we're dealing, although fundamentally, with a cultural problem here in going from IT security to OT security. Our world does not have a culture around doing this. We expect the control systems to operate the building. We haven't necessarily designed them to do that work and do it securely, whether that's at the supply chain level from the owners through the vendors, involving how often does everybody in that supply chain go through security training? Rarely. Are there industry standards and regulations we can point to for our industry? The answer is not really. And often when we do try to get IT involved, we find a lot of challenges getting both the facilities departments and the IT to work well together. So there's a whole cultural shift that we're facing here as an industry. And there's a couple big unanswered questions. Who is responsible? Who owns this problem? Is it, in the IT world, the CIO and the CISO, it's clear who has responsibility for the infrastructure and for the policies. not true in the facility side. And the facility side rarely has a budget for securing things. So who should pay for it? So this is all part of the challenge of the journey we're under. And it's going to be a team effort. Manufacturers, systems integrators, and owners all have to step up and do a better job in this regard. Lastly, I've referred a lot to IT versus OT. And NIST, if you're not familiar with them, has a whole cybersecurity framework that has become a de facto standard for the overall industry. And last year they came out with a report called NIST 8228 and concluded that the Internet of Things world is fundamentally different. And they summarize it in the 3 statements here on the left. The fact that OT interacts with the physical world, that these systems cannot be accessed and managed in the same way as IT devices. And finally, the availability and effectiveness of the cybersecurity capabilities in OT is often very different than IT, leaving the IT folks scratching their heads on what to do. So with that, I'll have completed my session here, and I'm going to get Luis to follow me.
All right, hopefully my slideshow is up.
Good to me.
Okay, good. Thank you, guys. So yeah, Alvarez Technology Group, we started in the IT space. We have a 20-year history in information technology, going back to the simple world that we lived in the early 2000s, where life was a lot less complicated and COVID did not exist. But over the years, we've become more and more integrated with our clients in managing their IoT systems. And over the last decade, in particular, we started to get into a lot of physical security work for them and helping them integrate that into their existing environment. So it was interesting for us in our journey going from IT to OT because we looked at it differently than if you did it the other way around. So when we talk about physical security, we're really talking about 3 elements that we work in: video surveillance, access control, and then alarm systems. And typically these areas are dominated by alarm companies, people who have traditionally worked their way into video surveillance because they were doing an alarm system for somebody and then moved into access control afterwards. Because we come from the IT space, we started working in terms of understanding what the requirements were around physical security. Obviously, protecting the facilities that we are working with is critical. Video surveillance is also something that you're seeing more and more of. They used to say that London had more cameras per capita than any other city in the world, and I think they probably still do. But video surveillance is now paramount, and it's now widely deployed throughout pretty much everywhere you go. And it's a growing industry for us, and we find that video surveillance brings with it a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of responsibilities. When you talk about video surveillance, you're talking about the cameras, of course, but then you have the video storage that you have to provide, and sometimes that can be a significant issue, especially as the cameras proliferate throughout the facility. We started working with a lot of cannabis companies in California when cannabis was legalized in November of 2016. And part of the compliance requirements is that any facility that has cannabis, whether it's seed or manufactured product, you have to track the entire thing from seed to sale. So it has to be on video 7x24 for up to 90 days. We're not talking about motion detection. We're talking about if it's sitting on a shelf, there has to be a camera that's looking at it. When you stop to think about, most of these facilities have between 40 and 140 cameras. Our largest deployment is about 1,200 cameras in a very large greenhouse facility in Central California. That's a lot of storage. So what you are looking for in our case is ways to compress that video so that you can use less storage. And there are algorithms out there. H265 right now is the most current one that really does a terrific job of reducing the footprint of the video storage, but you're still talking about terabytes of data that have to be stored in the case of these cannabis companies. And in that example that I gave you about the 1,200 cameras, we have over a petabyte of drive space that's being used in multiple network video recorders that are all collecting data from these cameras. We also tie those cameras into access control systems so that we can track people that are going in and out of these facilities, which is now becoming a bigger requirement, not just for cannabis, but for a lot of our clients that want to be able to see who's accessing what and where. So these access control systems are becoming much more sophisticated, whereas before you just had a standard card like the one that's displayed there that you rubbed against the side of the device. Now they're looking for things that can be used on smartphones, that can detect the badges that people are wearing using near field sensors so that you don't have to necessarily touch anything. And especially as we move into the new abnormal of a post-COVID world where contactless activities are going to be the desired outcome, you're going to see a lot more of these systems become separated from a physical to more of a smartphone app or something that can detect radio frequencies nearby so that you don't have to touch anything. And alarm systems tie into all of these things because each one of them plays, provides an additional layer of security, an additional layer of protection for the facilities that we're working with. And of course, we're all connected all the time now. So all of these camera systems that we put out there, not only are they physically in these facilities, but they can be accessed remotely. So cybersecurity is a significant component of the services that we provide. And it, to Steve's point, OT cybersecurity is similar to IT, but it's different. So you don't, in the IT space, for example, you don't normally deal with things like firmware upgrades. You deal with software patching. Most people don't really care about the firmware that's running on the hardware that they have. They should, don't get me wrong, but it's not something that they care about. Whereas in the OT space, firmware, especially when it comes to cameras and access control systems, are critical because vulnerabilities pop up all the time. And these vulnerabilities can be exploited by the bad guys just as readily as anybody once they're detected. So, for example, we had one of our camera manufacturers about 6 months ago release a major patch for a pretty significant vulnerability that would allow anybody to take control of cameras and redirect the video because these cameras all have this protocol called OnViv that allows them to do that. So we had to patch thousands of cameras that we had deployed out there. But obviously in the old days that would have been a truck roll, sending somebody out, plugging in some sort of device onto their network, and then pushing out that firmware. Well, because all of these systems are connected and we're managing them remotely from our network operations center, we can access them and push out that firmware from one central point. But we have to make sure that that one central point is connected securely to all of these systems using VPNs and encryption so that we don't have any more points of vulnerability. A lot of these systems now are centrally managed, especially for larger organizations. One of our clients, for example, has offices in LA, San Francisco, Nevada, and as well as the Central California where we're located. And they want one central system to manage all of those locations and all of the access control systems in each at those locations so that they can turn somebody's badge off from one place and that is turned off everywhere. Or conversely, if they have somebody who's visiting one of those other facilities, they want to turn on temporary access when they're at the facility, but then make sure that's deactivated when they leave. Because the level of physical security now is continuing to grow as literally the threats are growing. And That has not changed in the post-COVID world that we live in. And in fact, it's created some opportunities for us that address specific needs in a post-COVID world. So for example, many of our clients in the hospitality industry, when COVID hit in California, they were shut down. And that meant that those facilities, they had to lay off all the workers, but they still had to monitor the facilities to make sure that there was no damage done, that nobody was sneaking into the hotels or into the restaurants and you know, trying to do something they shouldn't be doing. But paying people to stand around and guard these facilities 7x24 was an expensive proposition. So working with one of our partners, we found a technology that was available. It's essentially, you know, for those of you that are familiar with the Ring doorbell concept, right? This a camera that can detect motion and then alert you that somebody's in front of your house. Well, this takes it a step further, and they actually use AI to detect if there is a real intruder or a real concern, so that they don't have any false positives. And if the artificial intelligence engine determines that yes, this is a real, potentially a real threat, they alert basically a security operations center that will then tap into the camera and can actually talk to whoever's standing in front of the camera and determine why they're there, and scare them away or call the police if they have to. So it's a level of sophistication way above and beyond what's been available, and it's very inexpensive. So we've been deploying a lot of these systems for these facilities, and they're going to continue to use it after they open up because it's a much more effective way of handling security after hours than they were using before. We've also seen a huge demand for thermal cameras for temperature screening. And if you go to Las Vegas right now, you're going to pass through one of these devices and you're going to see whether you have a fever or not. And then if it detects that you're above the threshold, they're going to take you away, you know, set you aside for secondary screening. These systems are sophisticated, have the exact same issues that we run into with our surveillance systems, whereby they're connected, they have to be managed remotely. They also tie into access control. So for example, you can use the kiosk system that you see there not only to detect if somebody has a temperature, but also to use facial recognition as a way for access control, so that it becomes a contactless way to let somebody into an office space or let somebody into an area of the facility that they need to get into. Again, all the same issues that we talked about before in terms of protecting the data, protecting the information, but more so because now with facial recognition, you're talking about privacy. And so you need to be able to provide a level of protection of that data above and beyond what you normally would do, including encrypting the data, including encrypting the video, if you take video or if you save the video. So it's become something of a challenge as we have started to deploy these systems, because now we're deploying them in school districts, for example. They're looking for ways to allow students back into those facilities without having to hold up a thermometer at each one of those kids' heads, especially when you're talking about, you know, some larger school districts where you may have 1,200 kids going to school. It's a challenge, and these systems allow them to speed that process up, but they also have the need to protect that information and make sure that these systems are not going to be hacked and nobody takes advantage of them. And finally, one of the more interesting technologies that we're starting to deploy for some of our retail clients is something that we call Atom. It's a social distancing system. It's actually very similar. If you've heard the news this week, Amazon has developed their own version of this, and they're deploying it in their offices for the same thing, to enforce social distancing. And it will notify people, whether it's in management or the individuals themselves, if they're getting too close together. It's smart enough. It's a cloud-based system, so the AI tools can recognize if people are allowed to be together, maybe a family that walked into a restaurant together, and they can sit together and it won't alert on that. But again, all the same issues that we talked about before: protecting the data, providing a secure way to access the cloud console that this runs on, and being able to ensure that there's no information that can be compromised. So for us, physical security has been a real opportunity to grow our business, but also to integrate into our existing IT environment and make sure that we take the knowledge that we gained in IT and applied it to OT, as I like to say. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pete.
Well, first off, I wanted to thank both Steve and Lewis for joining us today. I pretty much think that they pretty much hit everything that I'm going to cover, so I'm just going to reinforce what they said. I've got a few things to go over, so I'm just going to hop right in it. I've got 15 minutes, and if you don't know me, I can get to talking. So when you're talking about building automation security, whether it's post or pre-COVID, personally, I think it's needed more now than ever. When we're talking about BAS physical security, we're talking about the mechanical equipment. How accessible is your cooling tower or your hot water plant from a potential hacker, protester, whatever the case may be. Hardware panels. Who really has access to those hardware panels? I think in a future slide, you're going to be kind of surprised on just how easy or how many people have access to your quote unquote locked panels. And as Steve mentioned and kind of hammered home, the building automation server shouldn't be treated just like a regular computer. I mean, time and time again, I've been on job sites where the server itself is sitting under some coworker's desk and they use it to surf eBay and do all kinds of things that they wouldn't on the normal corporate computer, because more times than not, the building automation server is kind of left on its own, kind of abandoned in never land. So when you're also talking physical security, I personally think that personnel security has to come into play on that. It is imperative for an individual to have good cyber hygiene. They need to be aware of their security needs. If they're interfacing with a system, they need to know, on at least a 10,000 foot level, that I have to have device security. I have to have, the security for, the connection to the cloud. There's things that you just need to know. You also need to be aware of social engineering. If we look at the Target hack that happened a few years ago, everybody likes to say that it came in through the building automation system. Well, if you actually dig down to the details, it was actually a phishing scheme that just so happened to get one of the building automation vendor's credentials for a vendor portal, and it had nothing to do with the building automation system. So you could imagine if maybe the cola vendor, or soda pop, distributors account got hacked, because then the stories would read that, the hackers got in through the soda pop machine. So, you definitely want to read into the details before you just go and blame somebody's system. Security is everybody's job. It doesn't, stop at the end user. It doesn't stop at the management. It doesn't stop with the installing contractor. I mean, it's everybody's job to make sure that all the systems are secure. Human error is going to get you every time. When we start talking about cybersecurity and internal threats, a lot of people like to think in the OT world that the IT department is out to get them, or that, they just don't like to play nice with people. And really what it comes down to is that I do believe that a lot of the IT guys are very, very passionate about what they do, and they approach the network and the communication of the information a little differently than, say, an OT guy would. And, that can go down, my biggest kind of argument and discussion on this is the whole CIA versus SAIC conversation, and that could take up a whole webinar on its own. But basically, just what's more important, the confidentiality of the data or getting the data there, you know, as fast as possible and as safely as possible. When you're talking about external threats, this is actually one of the things that I really, you know, like to cover, because it does show a glaring issue with building automation. You know, you've got people installing systems that, you know, while they're really good at changing out compressors and they're really good at troubleshooting low voltage circuits, you're now asking them to go into a world that they might not be savvy about. So when they open up that backnet router or that backnet application controller and they say, okay, this is how I hook it up to the network, I'm going to use all the default settings, default usernames and passwords, you can see where things kind of go awry. And it's no fault of that guy who's basically thrown a box of parts from his boss and said, go make it happen. There should be a way, or there should be a system in place that would help that guy kind of get his equipment online safely. And that's what I hope that, you know, people are going to realize, that, you know, when you've got these devices and you open them up to the front, you know, to the world, you know, you've really got to pay attention to the security needs. Some of the external threats that I want to cover, Shodan IO and a script kiddie. You're going to see really how easy it would be for just, you know, a beginning hacker to compromise a forward-facing system. One of the things that I think Steve and Lewis covered on is, you know, access control and user management. When that user leaves, or when that employee leaves, and now with COVID, you know, a lot of people are getting laid off. You know, they're definitely going to remove their email access. They're definitely going to remove their network access. But what about the auxiliary systems that they potentially have access to? The building automation system that's a standalone server. Maybe they've got some TOSI box keys for customers' remote sites. You know, these are things that need to be taken into consideration. Quick and dirty remote access, I think I covered that with just the guy who just needs to get it installed, who might not know exactly what's going on. Lost and found, the USB stick that's lost that you find walking into work, chances are it's not lost, it's just waiting for you. And again, social engineering, I can't beat it in enough. They don't know what Disney character you really are. Personal and corporate security, more remote workers. It is more and more imperative these days that you stay up to date on malware, antivirus software, and operating system updates. Definitely need to implement some kind of password management or two-factor authentication where you can. Don't share, reuse, or write down passwords. Steve showed a great picture of the username and password on the monitor. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that in the field. Audit user accounts often. We kind of you know, covered that. It's more than one person's job. If you're a user of a system and you see somebody who hasn't been in the corporation for, you know, a few months, if you know that they don't need access but that user account's still there, it's really your responsibility to bring that to somebody's attention. Don't clickbait. Don't assume that, you know, just because you got a resume in a PDF form that it really is just a PDF. I mean, if you're not expecting to get a attachment from somebody and you just get one out of the blue, I definitely, you know, kind of find those suspicious. Phone phishing, believe it or not, it does happen. People in a rush could potentially give out information. Please be aware of that. Smartphone security, nowadays with everybody wanting to be online, wanting to be able to see their systems remotely, wanting to be able to do everything remotely, you're seeing a lot more companies having bring your own device and, you know, mobile device management situations where you're having to give access to your personal device, you're also having to give access to the corporate. Where does that security and privacy kind of mesh with each other? Corporate scanners aren't all that. Be wary of approved links and attachments, because just because the corporate scanner doesn't know about it doesn't mean that it's a zero-day attack. No matter how fancy the security platform, if a user doesn't take the proper precautions, it doesn't matter, it's not going to work. And like Steve and Lewis mentioned, security regulations are real, and nobody's without excuse in the courts. I guarantee you that if you are found, or even could potentially be found to have caused a potential security breach on a large system, some sleazy lawyer is totally going to take it upon themselves to see if they can hang you as high as they can. When we're talking about physical security, again, like Steve said, default usernames and passwords, sticky notes or wall notes. This is an operator interface for a building automation system. And if the username and password is right there with maybe a couple of, hey, double check this point, double check that point, it's not going to take you long to push a few buttons and start to shut stuff down. This lighting control panel in the lower left, client was said, hey, it's just a lighting panel. We don't need to put keys on that panel. And with a few keystrokes, we showed him that the entire building's lighting system could be compromised, and it woke him up pretty good to the fact that he needed to start locking that up. Physical access in anything is going to be really bad. If the person has access to your equipment, whether it be your boiler system, whether it be your cooling water system, if they want to do damage, there's really, at that point, it's all over. So power is everything, and access control is key. Speaking of keys, be aware that one key could potentially fit many unintentional things. Generic tri-key sets are easily had, and just because somebody has a big set of rings walking around your building doesn't really mean they belong there. Especially in today's day of COVID, there's less people in buildings. I think that a lot of people are going to take opportunities to try and penetrate buildings. Pickers come in all shapes and sizes. This beautiful young lady happens to be my fiance, and we both practice the sport of lock sporting. This is an actual key set sold online. So these two key sets right here is going to get you into every single building automation panel that I'm aware of, all access control panels, all fire alarm panels and poles, most elevator operation and modes, which is really scary if you think about it, possible escalator service switches, all thermostat covers, most electromechanical key switches, many toolboxes, lock boxes, many office and electrical cabinets. And I wondered what the Ford key was with this set that I found on eBay, and it's actually a fleet key. And believe it or not, Ford, when you bought a fleet of vehicles, you had the option to have everything keyed to one key, and that's it. So you could see how that would be a security risk. As far as cybersecurity goes, Steve touched on, old systems. This is a true story. We had a legacy system running XP. It was running a very important building. We went ahead and made sure that there was no outside access. We had it isolated on its own VLAN. The upgrade of the system was planned after a large project in the building was to be completed later on that year. We had facilities crews on that site daily to make sure that the building was in operation, everything was taken care of. We had the local campus guy, IT support. Network security guy one day just decides that there's no access for you. So now our supervisor had no way to get out and talk to our controllers. We had no way to see it on the graphics when we were in our mechanical room. We actually had to go around to each one of the individual controllers, manually plug in and check the building for a few weeks. Luckily, control was restored, the building was upgraded, and all good was again. But this really does go to show you how, you can pre-plan everything, and if the left hand and the right hand aren't talking, you could potentially have some issues. When you're talking about external facing equipment, this is really what keeps me up at night. There are websites that you can go out to. This is Shodan, and with just putting in something like BBMD, this is the results that it's going to provide to you. As you can see, we've got 3,355 devices as of a few days ago responding to a BBMD query. This gives you stuff like the product type, the IP address, the vendor name, the city and state, and could potentially give you identifying information about the site. All of this stuff is just because somebody didn't take the time to put the building automation system and protect it from the outside world. They just said, we're just going to go ahead and post that up. And you're thinking, well, BBMDs are the only thing that you can look up with this tool, right? No. Any Niagara 4 or Niagara AX devices out there? The AX device is reporting that it has a foreign device table in it. How nice. Do foreign devices require any kind of username and password? I don't think so. That's a huge security risk. Went and did a little extra dig, and mind you, this is all on a public website, all public information. I typed in 47808 and I found a juvenile center. This juvenile center showed me firmware and model numbers. As Steve and Lewis talked about with firmware upgrades versus software upgrades, if I see in there as a potential hacker that something has an older firmware, that could potentially be a security risk. So I mean, when it comes right down to it, you know, it's everybody's responsibility to protect their equipment from the outside world. With things open to the public, there's no special hacking skills needed. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether I'm shutting down an air handler or making a router stop talking, a denial of service is still a denial of service. So with that, I've got some links of interest here for building automation and kind of all of that kind of stuff. So if you guys want to check out more, please feel free. And with that, I think I've gone a little over my time limit, but I'm going to go ahead and send it back to, looks like Liz. So here you go, Liz.
Well, I went ahead and stole it myself. I'm going to go ahead and change screens.
Oh.
I think I'm showing the wrong screen. So, thanks everybody for joining us. Pete, Steve, Lewis, thank you so much for hopping on here and discussing this with us. And so now I think we're going to want to answer some questions. I think that's the part where we're at right now. So I've got some questions here from the audience. Oh, it's showing the wrong screen again. And this is just all right. All right, so this is fine. Our first question is that it seems like it's easy to forget the basics, but this webinar is basically reinforcing them. So I guess that's much less of a question and more of a talking point. So it sounds an awful lot like, having spoken with you guys, I mean, everybody except for the Shonan stuff that Pete talked about, which is a bit more than the basics, I think. It sounds an awful lot like, really what we need to do here is to reinforce the basics. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, one of the most important elements of our cybersecurity offering is cybersecurity awareness training, because too many organizations, well, and I think Steve will agree with me that the number one source of most breaches is people, and people who aren't properly trained or are not aware of the threats that they deal with. So we believe education, and especially education on the basics, the things that are critical for success, is very important.
Yeah.
We've got another question. Go ahead, Steve.
Just to build on what Lewis just said, our whole business is predicated on the notion of having our partners, which are controls contractors and systems integrators, become certified in our methodology for doing their job well. That's our whole premise. So we teach them what the basics are, and then in order to complete their work on any given system, we give them a checklist that they have to go through and validate that they've actually done all the things that they were supposed to have done in the first place. And then they can turn that report over to the building owner and say, okay, here you go. I've checked all the user configurations, the network's secure, the control server has been properly configured. And if you want to help, I'm happy to help you maintain that if you're not capable of doing it yourself. But I'll need a service agreement to do that.
Well, so
I think I'd agree with everything that those guys are saying. I'm trying to point to them. Service agreements for building automation systems is, that's, in my opinion, it's a no-brainer. The building owner has a lot more to do than to maintain systems, and if you have, somebody that's watching your back, it definitely helps out. So everything they said and then some.
Awesome. So I've got one here, and I think I heard some talk about this, but what are your thoughts on auto expire credentials?
I think it's the only way to go. I think you should have, every account in your system should auto expire. It's going to force you to make, edits and look at your, your user logs on a more frequent basis. If the CEO can't get into the system, I guarantee he's going to get action and he's going to have access again. So that's my take on it.
I'm seeing some head nods. So, Lewis, you think that's the same thing
Oh
with
yeah,
the physical
yeah.
security
We're
side?
big fans of auto expire credentials, or forcing people to change passwords on a regular basis, or having the systems. We try to automate a lot of our password management so that you don't have people with sticky notes on their screen saying, "Remember to change this password in 90 days." And here's the current password in case you forgot it. So it's a critical component of good security hygiene.
Just one point on that. Not all systems are capable of having auto expiring passwords just because they don't have the manufacturer hasn't built that feature into the product. So a way to mitigate that risk is to do periodic audits. Go look at the user log, go look at the basically every 3 months or every 6 months, go and audit the users and make sure they all belong there and they're set up properly. That's your backup if you don't have that feature in the system itself.
Okay, and this comment here is coming in from Chad, and he said that basically that it sounds like it's not just a company culture that needs to change, rather it's our industry's culture that needs to evolve to keep security at the forefront. So how can we go about to change that culture? What are some things that would need to change regarding security that can influence that change in culture?
A major breach that gets hits the Wall Street Journal.
Never waste a good crisis. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's just you have more and more government agencies talking about mandating compliance and mandating certain things, especially as the threat landscape continues to grow, and you have state actors that are getting into it now. This isn't like the old hacker who was in his mom's basement because he couldn't get a date. He decided to go out and attack a bunch of computers and see if he can break into things. These are people that are getting paid good money to do this kind of thing. And industrial hacking is a real thing, and it's we in the United States have not experienced it to the degree that several European countries have seen these attacks on their IoT systems. So we're going to see, I think, more regulation around it, but we need to get in front of that and not just wait patiently for somebody to force us to do that.
Yeah. Again, if you look at, I'm the, I guess the old guy in the room here. So when I got into the industry in the early 80s, the government, there was a group called Tri-Services Commission group that had built a specification for the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. And they came out with the first, essentially at that time it was called energy management systems, but that evolved into building automation in the 90s. And that spec became the basis for the specifications that entered the engineering community through your mechanical, electrical engineering firms. So the similar thing is starting to happen now. There's a spec called the RMF, Risk Management Framework, that's been widely adopted across the DoD. And if that spec and those requirements start to filter into your Newcomb and Boyd's and your other major engineering firms around the country, you'll see a shift on all new systems going in, which will then percolate down into the existing systems over time. So I think that would be a logical, significant first step, is to follow the government's lead and get it into the private sector.
Keep learning too. I mean, the New Deal blog is all about industrial automation and security. I can't stress it enough. I mean, as technology advances, so do the hackers and so do the vulnerabilities. So my opinion is to just keep educating yourself and stay on top of as much security as you can. Because it's only going to take one time for some evildoer to mess with your bits, and you're going to wish you had.
All right, so we got about 2 minutes left here. So 30 seconds, last word on security, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Pete, why don't you get us started?
Don't take security for granted. Don't think it's somebody else's responsibility. Take an active, role in questioning your security. Just because you've got a key to a building, that says it can't be duplicated doesn't mean that nobody can get in that building or nobody can get through that door. I think a lot of people have, misunderstandings or misguided kind of feelings about security, and I think that they just need to be aware of it. And if you don't know, ask. There's tons of resources out there that will totally help you get secure.
Steve?
Or find people like that will help you get secure.
Yeah, I think the OT world has benefited from security through obscurity. It didn't occur to us and to the hackers that OT systems were as vulnerable as they are. And a large part of the reason you don't hear about or it doesn't make it up to the C-suite, there's very little personal information in security systems. Maybe more so in Lewis's case with the video surveillance and the access control. That's personal information for sure. But in building automation, there's very little. And so as a result, there are no regulations. Somebody has their BAS system hacked, there's no requirement to turn around and publish that to the world. So it doesn't get published, you don't hear about it. So we continue to think there's not a problem here. But believe me, the frequency of attacks, there was a study done last year by Kaspersky that said almost 40% of BAS systems have been compromised. 40%. So the truth is you don't know that you've been hacked, but you have.
Wow. Well, it sounds like either Ginger or Rufus was trying to steal your thunder, but they didn't. Lewis, why don't you wrap us up for us?
Well, for me, I think what's important is not only to have a culture of security, but also a champion. Find somebody within the organization who really takes it on as their mantra. Everybody needs to practice it, but you need somebody who lives and breathes it and is the champion for the organization as a whole. We found that that's the way to make security top of mind and security successful.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Once again, Lewis, Steve, Pete, thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you for joining us on this panel. To every one of our attendees, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I hope you share it with your friends and coworkers who you feel might need it. There will be a copy available on YouTube to be consumed or watched at a later date at your own convenience. Once again, thank you so much. Have a great day.